Tell a wonderful story of love. Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. 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 Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love. For all the pure and blessed, rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
All right, so chapter 8, starting in verse 27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about it. Now, I'm going to stop there. Obviously, this is a very truncated record of this. It is in much more detail, and the conversations are much more detailed in the other gospel accounts. There is a singular focus that Mark is doing. And he starts off by asking his disciples an interesting question to me. Who do people say that I am? That is an external question. He's not saying, "Who am I?" He's not saying, "Who do you say that I am?" He's saying, "Who do they say that I am?" Others, people in general. And then what are the answers that Jesus gets back? Okay, what is true about all those people that are named there in that list? They got one thing in common. Well, they got two things in common. Okay, they're all prophets. And what's the other thing they have in common? They're all dead. Why would people say that he's someone who's dead?
He raised the dead.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. And I would agree with that to some extent. They were familiar with things that the prophets had written. All of the prophets essentially ended up dead, right? And not just from time. Most of them were killed. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not kill? Jesus would ask the Jews at one point. John the Baptist most recently, really hadn't been all that long since John had been beheaded. It would seem, now who was it that had John beheaded? Herod. And it would seem from what we read in the text that Herod was afraid it was John the Baptist because he kind of thought John was coming back to get him. But what this tells us is that these people are not opposed to the idea of something that is supernatural. They believe that the man Jesus, who clearly is a prophet, has to be one of the great prophets of God, resurrected, living again. I wouldn't say reincarnated. I don't think they had any concept of reincarnation, so we need to get those ideas out of our head. That's not the suggestion. The suggestion is that they were resurrected, they were raised again, that they came back to life. Elijah, major prophet. John the Baptist, most recent prophet. These are not talking about these obscure prophets that no one really knew, but actual, main, well-known, significant prophets. That indicates that they were recognizing the power and authority of Jesus. That the miracles were having the effect that they were supposed to have to a degree. Now that introduces another idea as well. Is this a measure of faith that these people are exhibiting here? A measure, but a very, very small measure of faith. They are recognizing that he must be a prophet, he must be from God, that these things are not normal, but they're rejecting what he's saying. Because what is he telling them? Things like, I am the bread that's come down out of heaven. I am the life. Things like that. They're rejecting him as the Messiah that had been prophesied. He just must be a prophet who has come back. And so that gives you a feel for what the general population was doing with Jesus and doing with the teaching of Jesus. Now, this is setting the stage and laying the foundation for the focus of these next couple of paragraphs. So then he turns to them and says, okay, but who do you say that I am? Now, this is the 12. These are the ones who had been with him the whole time, since he had called them for almost, well, for let's just say 3 years. They had been with him day and night. They had heard the things that he had taught. They had seen things. They had all that's taken place. Who do you say that I am? Peter's response is what he cuts to in Mark very quickly. And he goes directly to the confession and not the other parts of the conversation. You are the Christ. So they ultimately recognized more of what Jesus was saying and more of the point of what Jesus was doing. And that would make sense, wouldn't it? The people closest to him that saw the most and heard the most would believe the most. Now, here's a free little tidbit that's not directly related to this text, but it is something that reason would tell us. That would also tell me that my faith is going to be proportional to what? How much time I spend reading and studying these things. If their faith was greater and they understood more and recognized him for who he was better, by the way, they're not there yet, but they're well on their way there. If they did that better because they heard more, they saw more, and they experienced more, the same is going to be true for us. Our faith is going to be directly proportional to the amount of time that we spend reading and studying the Revelation, reading about the works of God, reading about what he's going to do. We come to understand it more and more, and as our understanding grows, what happens? Our faith grows. Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Okay, so that's implied in these things. Notice verse 30, though, and we've seen this a couple of times, and you see this in a couple of other places, but Mark has pulled it in a couple of times here. He strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Why? Obviously, he's interested in knowing what people think, right? What do people say? Who do people say that I am? Who do you think that I am? He's interested in knowing what people think, so why does he say to the people who know him best, don't tell anyone about me? And the language is strong, right? He strictly charged them to tell no one. Why? Well, that's actually a good answer to see how much faith will they listen to him. Because it was not time. That's exactly right. Everything was happening on a strict timeline. His introduction into the world, when he started his work, you'll remember the first miracle that he works. When his mother first comes to him with the problem, he says what? Woman, it's not yet my time. And that theme appears throughout the Gospels. There are times when the officials are seeking him, wanting to kill him, and he hides from them. Is it because he's afraid? No. Why does he hide? Because it's not time yet. It was a very specific time that the events had to unfold and take place. And so it wasn't yet time. When would it be time for them to tell people about him? When he tells them to, which actually in this book happens at the very end of the book. And that is what the Gospel of Mark is working toward that charge, when it is time to make him known to the world. You have a question or comment? Yeah. He was always provoking man. That's actually what he came to do. You'll recall that when he spoke to Paul after the resurrection and the ascension on the road to Damascus to qualify Paul to be an apostle, he asked him, why are you kicking against the goads? Do you know what a goad is? A stick that's been sharpened or put a point on it to prod animals along. That is what the scriptures are doing. That is what Jesus was doing, was provoking people in the direction of God, moving them. That's why he calls himself a great shepherd. And so we need to think about all of what's going on and the big picture, because a lot of us, being very short-sighted, would say, hey, go tell as many people as possible. You know what? Jesus isn't interested in renown. He's not interested in making a name for himself and being, what's he interested in? Accomplishing the will of the Father. Doing it exactly the way God wants it done. That's also another lesson for us. We need to be patient, and we need to do things the way that God directs them to be done, how God directs them to be done, and when we have the information, when he directs them to be done. And then be willing to be patient and wait for the plan to unfold. Mark's already talked about that as well, right? When he told that parable about the guy who plants, and he said he plants his seed, and then he just waits. And there's no more that he can do about it. And the seed sprouts, and it grows up, and it puts its flower on, and it sets its fruit eventually. And then he has work to do again. Then it's time to harvest. But all of that stuff in the middle, the sprouting and the growing and the fruit bearing, isn't our business. We plant and water. Paul would say, who gives the growth? God. God's the one that sprouts. God's the one that grows. God's the one that flowers. God's the one that sets fruit. God's the one that decides it's not going to rain ever again, and I'm not going to get any figs this year. Or bananas. Figs or bananas, neither one. Nothing. Listen, if it was up to me, my banana trees would have flowers and fruit all over. I like bananas. I don't have any control over that. All I can do is sit and wait. Do it not only God's way, but patiently, allowing it to work in God's time. We sing a song about that, don't we? In his time. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He began to, right after they say you're the Christ, he then teaches them. He says, don't say anything to anybody about who I am. Listen to me. There's some things that must take place. Before anyone could come to Christ, what had to happen? He had to die. Listen, the cross doesn't happen. No one comes to God. No one. It's not yet time. There's some things that have to happen first. And by the way, you're not going to like some of these things. And in fact, in other places where he's explaining to these same men what will take place, those among them like Peter stand up and say, no, we'll never let that happen. And what does Jesus have to say to him? Get behind me, Satan. Why does he call him Satan? Because he was desiring to thwart the plan of God. These things must happen, is the language here. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected and be killed. And after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Man, the utter gall of someone who just said, Jesus asked, who do you say that I am? And Peter's the one that stands up and says what? You are the Christ. Now, what does Christ mean? The anointed one, which has reference to the Old Testament prophets. And who was the anointed one? The Savior. To say you are the Christ is to say you are the Savior. You're the one sent by God that's been promised For all of these years, you are the man. All right, let me explain something to you, he says. I'm going to have to suffer. I'm going to have to be rejected. I am going to have to die, and then I'm going to be raised. And Peter says, come here. I need to tell you something. And he rebukes him. What's it mean to rebuke him? Yeah, he fussed at him.
They still didn't understand the human spirit. They thought he was going to come and destroy Rome and everybody.
There were things that they clearly still didn't understand. That's absolutely certain. And essentially, again, as I mentioned, we have to look at the other gospel accounts because Mark is extremely succinct to get more of this picture. What Peter's saying to him is, no, I'm never going to let that happen. We'll never let them get you. They're never going to kill you. He had just said it must happen. The one that he just said, you're the chosen one of God. Listen, you can say a lot of things about Peter, but he wasn't timid. Get behind me, Satan. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. That's what Jesus responds to him in verse 33. Listen, we're not any different than Peter. When we're not satisfied with God's work, and we're trying to push the issue, and we're trying to rewrite the way things should be done, and we decide, you know what, that's not working, we need to do it this way. This will work better. We're basically doing what? The exact same thing. We're rebuking God, saying you got this all wrong, you don't understand what's going on. Let me help you out, show you the right way to do it. And we are not setting our minds on the things of God. Because the things of God are the things that God wills and that God does. And it's usually an impatience problem with us, potentially coupled with a little bit of arrogance. But an impatience problem that's not willing to trust God. And there's so many ways that can manifest itself. It can manifest itself in our individual lives. It can manifest itself in our congregational life. You know, things aren't happening the way that we ought to. There's not as many people coming as there ought to be. We need to add this. We need to do this. We need to make this change so we can attract people. In connection with that last one, remember, Jesus had just said to the one who said, you're the Christ, all right, that's good. You know who I am. Don't tell anybody that. Keep it to yourself. You know how frustrating that must have been? To these 12 men who had, listen, they had left a lot. They were doing a lot. Let's not sell them short. Where was Peter's wife? At home. Most of these guys were fishermen. There was one that was a tax collector. Were they going to work every day? You think their lifestyle changed any when they walked away from their fishing boats and began following Jesus? You know, they weren't sleeping in a house anymore, getting their food from the grocery store. How were they eating? There were some women who were giving money to Jesus, and they had a collection, and Jesus would say, yeah, okay, go buy some bread. And then there's Judas who was stealing from that money, but that's another story. We do the same exact kind of thing. I mean, these people walked away from a lot. They made a lot of changes. They were invested in the outcome, and that's actually what we see coming out in Peter. It wasn't the outcome that he wanted. when Jesus said these things must be, that's not the way he envisioned it. Just like we don't always envision the church to look like it looks. And we want this or we want that or we...
Your way is not correct.
And that's essentially what we do. The minute that we start making alterations or carrying out our own personal desires and will, we're doing the exact same thing that Peter's doing here. And what does Jesus say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. That should be a really humbling thing. Because listen, when we do what Peter did, that same charge is leveled by God against me. Calling the crowd to him, verse 34 opens up with his disciples, and so they're still with him, but he invites the rest of the crowd to come. Let him deny, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. Now that's the opposite of what Peter had just done, right? Peter had just been told, your mind is not on the things of God, but on the things of man. So he calls everyone around. He says, listen, if you want to follow me, then you have to deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? All right, and I'm going to use this, and I'm going to be generic. I'm not going to use any names. It doesn't really matter. This could be anyone. It could be anywhere. It could be anytime. It could be any, what is popular to call today, any faith tradition. I hate that language, but that's the popular language today. There are people who have exhibited the skill of persuading men and collecting men and building big things. Churches, using very heavy air quotes there, because they are churches of their own creation when you get down to it, but churches that in the name of Christ become huge and powerful and affect millions of people. These ministries can move millions of people. And these are the kinds of people that you see being courted by politicians. So somebody wants to be president, and he knows if this person is associated with me, then all of their millions of followers are going to do what? Vote for me. That's the kind of influence that these people have. And the power brokers of the world know that they have that kind of influence. And they amass millions upon millions of dollars, and they build huge organizations that do lots and lots and lots and lots of things. It's possible. But what does it profit a man if he should gain the whole world and the president's ear, but he's not doing the will of God? That's essentially what Jesus is saying here. Guys, if you want to follow me, you have to forget your own will and replace it with God's, because it doesn't profit you to gain this entire world if your soul is lost. Now, we'll back this up a little bit to Jesus being rebuked by Peter. Again, what was Peter rebuking him about? That he must suffer and be rejected and die and be raised on the third. We're not going to let that happen to you. Well, if that doesn't happen to me, you're going to lose your soul. What does it profit you if you gain this entire world and you lose your soul? What can a man give in return for his soul? What does that question mean? I think we read that question, and I'm not sure that we always really grasp what he's asking. What does that question mean?
What does it cost to buy you back?
Okay. Which is really what he's saying by that is what? What can you do to redeem your soul? How are you going to redeem your soul? See, the only person that could redeem anyone's soul was Jesus. And the only way that he could do it was how? By carrying out the plan of God. What are you going to do? If you're going to stop this from happening, or if you're going to decide to impose your plan in the place of God's plan, what can you do to redeem one soul? Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words. Now, this is not in a vacuum. This is connected to the events that we've just been reading about. And so it is connecting this idea of Peter's rebuke and unwillingness to accept what Jesus said must be as being ashamed. Which means when I preach a different gospel than the one that's revealed, I'm ashamed of what God has said. Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in his glory, or in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Look, there's a cost. There's a cost to rejecting the plan of God. Yes, ma'am.
Even though he's not a member, he said, Mom, spread the word. Because what he said, I stood up and started spreading the word to everybody. And it was like, I looked at him and I thought it takes just one thing like what my son said for me to realize, get on with it.
Yep. And you know, there is, well, I'm just going to say it this way. We can learn from anyone. He goes on in chapter 9, truly, truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power. Now, for the people that are still walking around saying that the kingdom is yet to be established, and that is a popular doctrine. That's a popular doctrine. Several different forms of it, and I don't question the earnestness of these people. I don't question the sincerity of these people. But how they can read something that direct and that plain and miss that Jesus is saying, look, this is going to happen while you're still alive. Now, again, this ties back to what he taught his disciples where this conversation started. I must suffer, I must be rejected, I must die, I must be buried, and I must be raised. Now he is giving a time frame. It's not yet time for you to preach me, but I'm telling you, it's going to happen in your lifetime. The day is coming when these things are going to have transpired, and it will be time for you to tell people who I am. All of this is about identifying who Jesus is. I wanted to make sure it was It was on the board. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. What does the word transfigure mean? Trans means change. Figure is his shape, his appearance, his form. We might say transformed before them. There's a select group of disciples. In fact, how many of them are there? 3 of them that are going to be able to see who he really is. They're going to be allowed to see something that, well, quite frankly, the rest of mankind didn't get to see. They didn't get to see with their eyes like this. We see it through him and through his teaching and through his ministry, through the word. But anyway, he was transfigured before them. His clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses. Listen, Elijah represents the prophets. Moses represents the law. They were talking with Jesus. Here's the interesting. How'd they know it was Elijah and Moses? Had they ever see Elijah or Moses? Yeah. They were talking. They heard what they were saying. I don't know exactly what they were saying. They knew who it was. Or we know who it was. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 tents." That's a terrible common word to translate there. Tabernacle is a better word because we associate that with the tabernacle of God, right? Let's make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Now, that's an important little rejoinder that's been placed in there because it gives some of the motivation. We read that and we go, he really ought to know better than that, right? He was familiar with the law, right? He knew that you shouldn't worship Moses and Elijah. He knew that. So why would he say something like that? Well, because he didn't know what to say. He was terrified. I don't blame him. A cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. "This is my beloved Son." You want to know who Jesus is? God displays his glory to them and then speaks directly to them and says, "This is my Son. Listen to him." Suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. As they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. See, that's when it's time to tell people who he is. Why? Because that's when people can come to God through it. Until then, it wasn't yet time. You know, we're on the other side of the resurrection, right? So who do we not tell? And we tell everyone, or we should. We don't always do it. Yeah. Let me real quick, I want to get through 13. So they kept this matter to themselves, so they listened to him. That's good because God just told them to. questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. And they ask him, why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? And he said to them, Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come. And they did to him what they pleased, as it is written of him. And he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail here. You have to go to other texts to actually ascertain this. But who's the Elijah? John, who was sent to make ready the way for the Lord. He said, Elijah has come. And you know what they did to him? What they pleased, they killed him. But by saying Elijah has come, you know what he's saying? It's time, it's me. And so this whole text that we just studied this morning, from that first part where he talks to the disciples about who do men say that I am and who do you say that I am, and Peter said, you're the Christ, from there to the end is a encapsulated picture of the identity, the true identity of Jesus. He is the Son of God, who came into the world to die for the sins of man, because no one can get to God unless that happens. And that's who he is. And that's what Mark is making very clear. And he does it by recording their confession of him, by presenting the image of him, and by recording the direct words of God. This is my beloved Son. Hear him. I got to stop. Appreciate your presence and participation this morning.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a day
of rejoicing that will be when